All right, we're approaching the end of the course. Today, we're going to be looking at ecosystem functioning. Let's see how did we get here though. So we established that 4.6 billion years ago, the planet came to be. It took about 0.1 billion, 100 million years for the moon to come in. Then for a billion years, nothing is happening other than maybe the creation of this thing called a protocell that works as a plastic bag that allows to contain molecules that then allow for complex things to emerge that led to the emergence of prokaryotes that then led to eukaryotes that 3 point something billion years after the first prokaryote, we ended up here with about 8.7 million species. We established that once the species originates, which can happen in four different pathways, the species start spreading until they colonize an area that is called the geographical range. Many species doing this simultaneously leads to the overlap of geographical ranges, and such that when you go and count the species on a given place, you ended up with different diversities on different places, and that leads to what is called the patterns in species richness. And we also showed that once those species start interacting on places and adapting to new environmental conditions, you ended up having different body sizes and abundances. Now, another thing that will emerge from you having different species, biomasses, and abundances on local communities is basically they start interacting and they start creating what is called an ecosystem. And how that ecosystem works is the topic of a big field of biogeography called ecosystem functioning. So again, basically what we're talking about here is the top 3 bios that we have described so far on how energy gets allocated once get to the planet. Basically the number of species, the body size of those species, and the abundance of those species. And the interaction of all of these factors is what you get what is called the ecosystem functioning. So how is the ecosystem functioning of an ecosystem measured though? Generally speaking, functioning is defined as the efficiency with which energy fluxes through an environment. That's the definition of ecosystem functioning. Basically, how efficient is energy to flow through a given ecosystem. So how do you measure that in the real world? When you look at a given ecosystem, you find a lot of different players, species interacting with each other, and they are part of different levels of the trophic pyramid. You get the energy, and that energy gets taken by the plants, then potentially decomposed, and is taken by the primary producers, secondary producers, sub-predators. So you can start picturing the different levels at which you can start measuring how the energy flows through that ecosystem. At the most basic level, of course, you get the composition, and you can start measuring things like nutrient cycling, how nutrients get changed through a given ecosystem. You can start looking then potentially at the primary production, how much energy from here goes through the nutrient cycling that ended up allocated to primary producers. You can also start looking at secondary production, or you can look at the biomass of the entire ecosystem. So here again are some indicators that you can use to measure how the energy flows through a given ecosystem. Of course, it's very complex. The flow of energy can go in so many different ways, and that's the reason why scientists normally focus on just 1 or 2 of those bios there. So as it relates to ecosystem functioning, again, the flow of energy, the efficiency of the flow of energy on a given ecosystem, most of the focus has been on how that efficiency relates to the number of species. Let me just give you some background in mathematics, Joe, so that you can understand in a moment the relationship between ecosystem functioning and biodiversity. Mathematically, this equation here, y is equal to a times x to the power of b, is what is called a power model. It's a power model because you have this coefficient that elevates the x value to the power of b. Now, it turns out that when you had that y variable here on this plot and the x variable here on the x-axis, what happens is that the number of this power exponent determines the shape of the relationship between x and y. So if this b parameter is smaller than b, normally what you find is what is called a saturating curve, right? So as you can see here, it's a saturating curve. As you increase x, Y also increase, but then after certain increases on X, Y doesn't increase that much. So you get what is called a saturating curve. Also it's called concave down relationship, and it's again cases when the power model has a B exponent that is smaller than 1. When that exponent is equal to 1, then of course you forget about A, then Y will become equal to X, and again you get a linear relationship between X and Y. There are other cases though where B is larger than 1. In those cases, what you find again is normally relationships that are called concave up, or exponential relationships in which Y increases exponentially for small increases on X. Again, that's what is called the power model, and what I want you to keep in mind is the significance of that B parameter, okay? Depending on the B parameter, you can get concave down linear relationships or concave up relationships. That is important because in a moment we're going to be looking at how people around the world have been trying to relate ecosystem functioning on the y-axis against biodiversity, and what is the parameter that they had found. So there is this guy, Brad Cardinale. He's the one that kind of started to put all of these papers together. So obviously there have been hundreds of papers relating ecosystem functioning against richness. And he put them all together, and he found on this paper in 2006 that out of 111 papers that had been published at the time, the power parameter was between 0.115 and 0.032. Basically, what we are talking about here is that all of these experimental studies have shown what is called a saturating curve or a concave down relationship, exactly the shape that you see here. So this is ecosystem functioning, whatever metric you choose here, against the number of species richness. What it was found is that as you increase the number of species on an ecosystem, the functioning of the ecosystem tends to flatten out. Now, that is the paper by Cardinale. Again, they put together 111 papers here, and they found that in experiments, all of the relationships had shown that biodiversity, the functioning of an ecosystem flattens as you increase the number of species. There is this other paper by Michel Leroux, and he found exactly the same thing. Again, this is a huge diversity of studies that he put together, and he shows here that, again, in this case, productivity as a metric of ecosystem functioning flattens, saturates as you increase the number of species. But the question then becomes, why? Why will that be the case? Why will these experiments show that the number of species, as you increase the number of species, the function on the amount of energy that flows through that ecosystem tends to flatten out? So in a paper written by Michel Leroux again in 2001, he speculates that there might be two driving forces for this relationship. Basically, if you had a pool of species and you increase the number of species, well, now the things that could potentially happen, of course, is that you are going to have more traits or more functions. And that leads to what is called complementarity. We talked about that earlier when you talk about niche specialization. And basically, when you have many species combining together, you are going to be using multiple parts of the resource, and that obviously will increase the number of the amount of energy that can flow through an ecosystem. The other possibility that they speculate is that as you start increasing the number of species, like in this case, assuming that the size of these triangles is related to the biomass that is flows through a given species, one of the things that you will observe, obviously, is that there are some species that are more abundant, they are bigger, so they are going to have a higher chance of having a larger flow of energy through them. They speculate that when you start increasing the number of species, there is a chance that you might, by chance alone, pick out those species that have large capacity to produce biomass. And again, that's what they refer as a sampling effect. Sampling effect, again, is just you having a random chance of picking up a species that can either hold or produce more biomass. And that is, again, two of the driving explanations for why is it that all of these experiments had shown concave down or saturating relationship between functioning and species richness. So when you look at the relationship, again, that seems to be universal from experimental studies, is the fact that the relationship saturates. But one observation that you can still make out of the hundreds of papers is that there is a huge variation on the slopes of these relationships. In some cases, biomass increases quite dramatically. In other cases, it doesn't increase as dramatically. The question then becomes why? why is there such a variability here on the relationship that has been found among studies between the functioning of ecosystems and the richness of those ecosystems. So there are multiple explanations. Again, here we're trying to explain what that's the case. One hypothesis that was proposed early on is the history of colonization. It's a paper by Fukuma and Peter Morin in Nature in 2003. This is what they did, just for you to realize that science doesn't need to be complicated. So they had these jars, right? Maybe a gallon bucket jars. And inside those jars, they had rotifers, protozoans, ciliates, and microflagellates. And these are microorganisms that you can actually will pop up on any of these things if you leave them open. And you can normally see that when you put water and let it outside, you start seeing turning green. And those are kind of, again, algae, but then that algae allows for all kind of microbes to arrive, including these guys here. So one of the things that they did, though, was to identify these guys very well. And what they did after was to modify the order in which these guys arrive in the jar, right? So basically, there is like a priority effect. Once the species gets to the jar, and then what happens when the second species arrives. And basically what they did, they modified the order in which this species arrive. And then they analyzed here ecosystem functioning. They look at productivity versus species richness, kind of the reverse on the axis, but that you have to forgive them for that. But the point of their paper was that depending on who do you put first on those jars, you ended up having different relationships. So here they had the same relationship with the same species. All what they modify in A, B, C, and D is the order in which these guys got to those jars. And then that allows them to conclude that the history of colonization, who gets to a place first, can potentially shape quite dramatically the shape of that relationship between functioning and biodiversity. And you can think about it, right? So imagine that there is an empty island, and a species that gets there first obviously has a higher chance of colonizing, potentially becoming more productive. If that, by any chance, that a species is a weak producer, then the relationship that you are going to get is going to be completely different if the species that arrive first is a species that produces a lot of energy, or that is efficient as recycling energy. So again, one of the first explanations for why there is a variability in the relationship between ecosystem functioning and richness was produced by Fukuma and Morin, and suggests that is simply the history of colonization, or the order in which species arrive to ecosystems. Another explanation for this variability is the heterogeneity of the habitat. There is a paper that was published by this guy Tilianakis in PLOS Biology. I don't know I don't know the person though, but that's his or her last name. What they did, they look at the grasslands, semi-natural grasslands, just landscapes that look like this, and they look at the relationship between biomass. They basically took all of the biomass of those grasses, and they related against the number of species. And what they did, though, was to separate locations that had high heterogeneity, medium heterogeneity, and low heterogeneity. And they find that depending on the level of habitat heterogeneity, you get different shapes of that relationship. So whenever there is high soil heterogeneity, you get a much steeper relationship. Basically, you produce a lot more biomass for the same given number of species. When it's medium, the slope is still inclined, it is positive, but not as steep. But when there is soil heterogeneity that is low, there is almost the relationship is very flat. The question, again, just to summarize here, when you take the relationship between the functioning and the diversity, and you take, for instance, 1 point of diversity, what you find is that the diversity at any heterogeneity increases as you increase heterogeneity. Again, the biomass production, or the functioning that you get, is significantly higher for the same level of diversity as you increase heterogeneity. Well, you can think about why. Why will be habitats that are more heterogeneous have more biomass than habitats that are not as heterogeneous, given the same number of species? The potential for that, again, it could be simply a specialization to those habitats. So basically, species in habitats that are more heterogeneous can specialize and optimize the use of resources in certain places, and that will potentially maximize the amount of biomass that you produce on those places, as opposed to places that have low heterogeneity when species obviously can interact more freely among them, and that interaction, of course, reduces the efficiency of a species to cycle energy, because they will have to spend and waste a lot more energy on fighting each other, competing, than in producing biomass. Again, thinking about the reasons for why there is a variability on the relationship between functioning and diversity, one possibility as well is the habitat heterogeneity. Another possibility that has been suggested is for this variability is disturbances. This is a paper by Brad Cardinale and Palmer, and what they did, they analyzed these caddis flies, and they look like this. These are animals, insects that you see living on streams, and here what they did, they look at again the biomass production of habitats where that species was there, and the number of species on those places, and they had these habitats that they disturb, and sometimes they did, and the other group, they didn't disturb, and then they look at the biomass of those places that were disturbed against the places that were not disturbed, and they found different relationships here. So for instance, in the places that were not disturbed, which are these places in black, you see that the biomass increases as the number of species increases, while in places that are disturbed, the biomass increases as the number of species increases. So pause this video and think about why. Why will there be the biomass of an ecosystem increase as you increase the level of disturbance given the same number of species, as opposed to a place where there is no disturbance? Obviously, one potential explanation here is that when you get a disturbance, basically the disturbance allows to remove the competitive advantage that some species might have. So obviously you don't have disturbance, their species are going to start interacting, and there is going to be an imbalance that is going to make one species to be more dominant than the other one, and that will cause potentially an extinction of the species that is weak. However, when you have disturbances, it's possible that these species that start dominating start getting knocked out by the disturbance because it's more abundant, and that kind of allows those two species to coexist, and as a result become more efficient in the use of energy. And that is one potential explanation for how disturbances will cause variations on the relationship between biomass production and the species richness. And again, what we're talking about here is the extent to which disturbances can help to explain that variation that we find between the biomass that is produced as a function of the number of species. Another possibility to explain this variation, again, between functioning and richness, is ecological interactions. This is a kind of a review written by Emmett Duffy in Ecology Letters, and he shows here that when you look at ecosystem functioning measured as different types of plant biomass against the diversity, you will find that there are different patterns to that relationship, whether you look at the diversity of plants alone, where you put herbivorous alone, or where you plants and herbivorous alone. So what he argues there is obviously there are different species with different capacities to cycle energy, and there's also changes in the efficiency of energy from one ecologic trophic to the next one, and obviously that you can expect those variations cause different shapes on the relationship between biomass and diversity. And again, this is a paper by Duffy, and it suggests that some of this variability that we find in the relationship between functioning and richness is a function of ecological interactions. Another possibility for this variation is basically an interaction between disturbances and trophic levels, right? And this is a paper by Ph.D. I think this is the same guys that did the work before that we talked about earlier, and about the priority of arrival. This is the group by Peter Morin. And again, the same deal, they had these jars. And what they did on these jars, though, they had different groups of species that can be classified as producers, bacteriorites, herbivorites, and predators. And what they did, they start warming up the water. They start warming up the water on those containers. And what they find is, of course, as expected, is that when there is warming, the predators, the herbivores, and the ones that eat bacteria, they normally die more wherever it is hot, right? Makes sense. You think about big predators and big herbivores, they are gonna die when it gets hot, while producers and bacteria-related species, they don't die as much. So what you can expect just from this figure of them determining the rate of extinction of a species on those aquariums, and most of the species that die when you heat up the water being predators and herbivores, and the ones that don't die as much are producers and bacteria. That alone already tells you then that in ecosystems that you get heat up are the producers and the bacteria that the ones that are going to produce the more biomass. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. So here they had the results of experiments that they heat up, in which they had different types of diversity, and with these 4 groups, and they, in some aquariums they heat them, and in other aquariums they just kept them at room temperature. What you can see here is that in aquariums where they were swarming, especially in high biomass, in high diversity, there was a high biomass, and again in low diversity there was still a high biomass, and those are again the species the biomass that is produced by producers. Exactly this group of species here. As you can see, temperature didn't do much to these guys, but when you analyze the biodiversity of that species in the entire ecosystem on a jar and you start heating it up, obviously there is no surprise that they actually are the ones that produce the most biomass in ecosystems that get hot, as opposed to ecosystems where the temperature remains cold. Again, the point that I'm making here is that anytime that you heat up the water, what they found is that most of the biomass that is produced on those aquariums are by the species that survive the hotter temperatures, which were the producers. Now, however, when they analyze the biomass of the entire ecosystem, all of the jars, not just the ones that managed to survive the temperature, what they find though is that the ecosystems that were the hot were producing the least amount of biomass, while the ones that remain constant produce the more energy. Isn't that interesting finding there? So what they find here is the fact that in aquariums that were heat up, right, obviously the herbivores and predators die. The energy that is available can be processed only by producers that dominate the production of ecosystems in environments that are hot. But when you analyze the total biomass that is produced in those places, it turns out that that biomass is much smaller than the biomass that is produced when the temperature is constant. Basically, in environments that are hot, you just kill off all of the top predators and the herbivores, so the energy cannot flow as easily there. So that's the reason why those ecosystems that get hot don't produce as much energy, as opposed to the ecosystems where the temperature remains constant there. Again, that's just not to say that biomass producers didn't produce biomass, because on those ecosystems, all of the biomass, in the ecosystems that are hot, all of the biomass is produced by these producers that didn't die because of the heat. One thing though that you should have noted up to this point in this lecture is the fact that all of the studies that were done early on for decades, this is a field of research that started maybe in the 2000s and it has been going on for 20 years now. Most of that work has been done at the level of experiments, either in jars like this or field experiments that are relatively small. So the effect of this, of course, is that their outputs are very simplistic. You can imagine here we're trying to simulate entire ecosystems in the world based on what happens on a jar. Obviously, they provide interesting insights like we just understand here, but can they really be replicated? The results at the global scale, can they be translated to see really what's happening in the real world? To answer that question, or really what's now happening in the real world, this guy came about. His name is Roberto da Novaro. He's from Italy, and he published this paper on deep nematodes. He went around the world, all of these places that you see here in colors in these maps, and he analyzed the biomass and the diversity of these nematodes. And what he found there, which was even fascinating, was that the slopes of the relationships between ecosystem functioning and richness were concave up. You guys remember all of the papers up to this paper in 2008 were based on experiments, and all of them have been showing concave down relationships. Roberto da Novaro, for the first time, goes to the field and wants to find out how is that relationship in nature, and he finds that the relationship is actually concave up. At the time when this paper was in 2008, I got super intrigued on this, and the reason why not many people had done this globally on land is because obviously you need to analyze ecosystems over huge geographical scales that it makes it for those analyses to be super rare because collecting the data is super hard. However, at the time, I decided that I wanted to answer the same question, but I wanted to focus on coral reefs. It took me about 3 years to put this database together. So what I did, I contacted a scientist from every one of those places. I contacted easily 60 scientists that had collected data on the biomass and the diversity of fishes on coral reefs everywhere on those places, from the Caribbean, the Eastern Pacific, the Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean. And I wanted to explore for coral reefs, what is the relationship between biomass and richness? Am I supporting the work that was done by Donato showing that the relationship is concave, or am I supporting the relationship by Loro and all of these other guys, Cardinale, showing that the relationship is concave down? So you can imagine my excitement as I was collecting this data from all of these places around the world. I put the data together on a plot just to see how the relationship looks like. And this is what I found, that the relationship is actually concave regardless of the region where you look at. And that's the shape of the relationship that we found. So now, it turns out that we had a contrast, right? So we had all of these experiments that have been done over hundreds of experiments by now, showing that the relationship between biomass and richness is concave down. But then there are at least 2 studies done globally showing that the relationship is actually concave. And the question then becomes, why that's the case? Why in experiments the relationship is concave down? Why in nature the relationship is concave up? One possibility, we had another paper that I published with Michel Loro and Roberto D'Anovato as well, was to explain why is that difference. One possibility that we speculate is niche specialization. So imagine that here you had 2 species, right, in red and in blue. Those are 2 species. When you had an experiment and you put the experiment there, right, imagine like an aquarium, and you put 2 animals that you take from a pond and put it into that aquarium. Obviously, those species are going to start interacting with each other. There's going to be intense competition on that aquarium. The resources are not limited. There is no places to hide. The time that they require to specialize is on the orders of tons of years. So in experiments, there is going to be a high degree of ecological interactions between the species that are put in there, while in nature, the ghost of past competition has forced these species to already specialize. So there is not going to be competition. So the speculation here is that obviously in nature, given this higher specialization, you are going to have higher production, while in experiments, that ecological interaction between species is going to make species waste energy on that competition, making then the production smaller on experiments. And again, this is one explanation that we suggest for why is it that in nature the relationship is concave, basically through a specialization. Every species that is added add more biomass, while in experiments, the competition that makes all species to start competing for certain amount of resources that are there, and that competition eventually just forces a species to minimize the amount of energy that is produced in the given ecosystem. Another possibility proposed by Michel Loro on this paper was that when you look at a trophic pyramid, obviously you have the primary producers and the top predators at the top. There are flows of energy on this. And one possibility that could be happening in nature is that we are losing the top predators, as we explained before. And basically, if you lose the top predators, what happens there is that then you increase the biomass, the efficiency of lower trophic groups, and then that results in an increasing production in nature that is simply the result of a trophic release of you killing off the top predators, right? So basically, by you wiping out the top predators in nature, what you ended up with is most of the biomass, an increasing biomass by the producers, that then could explain why in nature you get this exponential relationship. Again, basically what Michel Loro suggests is that by you losing the top predators, you increase the efficiency of production of primary producers in nature. That explains why that relationship is accelerating in nature. But what are the implications of what's the big deal? So experiments find that this is saturating in nature is exponential. Well, it turns out that there are a lot of different implications for why this is a significant issue for us to resolve. What is happening in nature? The implications are this. So when you lose a species, basically what you do, you lose exponentially the capacity to produce biomass or the efficiency in which you produce biomass on that ecosystem. While in experiments, if we trust the evidence that comes from experiments, we can really afford a lot of species being lost without having too much change in functioning, right? So again, that's the significance of this thing. We're talking about ecosystem functioning, which are the things that we feed on from nature. So this is what is happening in reality, which is an exponential increase. Every time that we are killing a species from nature, we are tampering significantly, exponentially, the capacity of that ecosystem to produce resources and biomass and functioning. But if what is happening is this, then you can afford to lose a lot of different species there without impacting the capacity of those ecosystems to produce biomass. Basically, another thing from experiments is basically the idea that there is a lot of redundancy on the ecosystem. Basically, you can afford to lose any species from here on because there are species that are redundant on those places. In nature, it's actually quite the opposite. Almost every species is unique, and that actually for me makes the most sense because again, through evolution and ecological interactions, those species will be specialized into specific habitats as a way to minimize that competition. So in nature, there is less redundancy, meaning that again, if you lose that one species, you might have lose an entire function of an ecosystem. So again, just to summarize, in nature, almost the loss of every species could have irreplaceable effects on the ecosystems, while in nature, you can afford to lose tons of species and that will not potentially influence as much the functioning of the ecosystems. And that again are some examples of the huge implications of us needed to resolve what is really happening in nature here, whether it's concave up or concave down. So unfortunately, that relationship between functioning and species richness in nature, that understanding is very limited. As I explained, the data that is needed for you to analyze that relationship is very hard to collect, and you have to collect it globally, and that kind of restricts the number of studies that have tested this. However, with the data that we already had, you can get some insights into some of the variation that you find in nature. So this is the paper, another paper that I analyzed in the Caribbean. This is the data just for the Caribbean, and you can see here the biomass production of coral reefs in the Caribbean against the number of species. And again, as I explained to you, it's concave up. In the prior paper, I analyzed every single region in the world. In this one paper, it was only the Caribbean though. One of the things that we decided to do for this paper is that one of the observations that we had was this huge variability though. Despite the fact that in average, the relationship is concave up, you still get a huge variability. One of the things that we decided to do was to separate locations depending on how many people were on those coral reefs, near those coral reefs. So here is the relationship, just a subset of these points in which there was almost no people near the coral reefs. And you can see that the relationship is super exponential, man, super steep. Now, when you start having locations that have between 100 people and 1,000 people, that relationship starts flattening. When you have people that is between 1,000 and 10,000 people, the relationship flattens even more. So I want you to start picturing from the subset of reefs, the relationship between biomass and richness start flattening as you increase the number of people. But what is remarkable though is the fact that when you had a lot of people on coral reefs, the biomass, that relationship increased, the slope of that correlation increased. So think about this like the succession. So the relationship that you will expect to see in nature everywhere is this. Where there are no humans, the relationship is super steep, but as you start increasing the number of people, that relationship starts flattening. But when you had a lot of people, that relationship comes back up. And here you can see actually how steep it becomes when you have more than, this is 1 million people near reefs. These are the slopes of these relationships here. So I decided to linearize this. And here you can see the slopes in these columns, depending on how many people are near reefs. And this is exactly what I explained. The relationship is super steep, where there is no people, start declining as you increase the number of people, but then it goes back up as you increase the number of people. So it seems like, again, when there is no people functioning, the capacity of ecosystems to produce biomass is huge. As you start putting people, that efficiency starts declining. But once you get to a lot of people, that efficiency for some reason goes back up. So we decided to investigate why, right? Why will that ecosystem functioning changes as a function of how many people are near reefs? We think about two possibilities. One is that as you increase the number of people, you reduce the number of people that uses those resources, or it could also, right? Or the other one is that somehow, as you increase the number of people, the pressures are so massive that ecosystems start adapting to those pressures that are being put in there. Again, two possibilities. One is that as you increase the number of people, you reduce the use of resources that you take from coral reefs. You think about this, right? So you had 1 million people that live on a place. The reality is that not 1 million people can be fed from a coral reef. So you will expect then that at those levels of people, the impacts that we had on coral reefs will reduce, as opposed to places where there is relatively fewer people, where they can be fed on those coral reefs, so the pressure could be more intense. That's one of the speculations here. The other one is that maybe what is happening is that the ecosystems start rebounding after something happens to the ecosystems. Let's analyze the work that we did to test these two hypotheses. The first one hypothesis is that humans reduce their use of reef resources. So in this paper, we analyzed the data on the amount of fish that is taken from coral reefs per square kilometer. This is by country, and this is number of people fishing, right? And we correlated that against the number of people. What you can see is that that relationship is steep on both cases. So basically what we are talking about here is that no, this is completely untrue, that as you increase the number of people, the pressures that we put on coral reefs get smaller. It's actually quite the opposite. When you increase the number of people, you increase the amount of fish that is taken from the reefs. So actually there's a ton more people going fishing. And the same thing here. When you increase the number of people, you increase the number of people within that group that can go and fish as well. So this hypothesis was a kind of nullified because we found evidence to suggest that no, as you increase the number of people, the pressures on coral reefs do not decline. The other possibility that we speculate here is that maybe what is happening is that there are changes in the community of coral reefs as a way again to adapt to those pressures that we are putting here. So here you can see the diversity of the biomass. This is the density of top predators and their body size in places that had no humans, places that had a lot of humans in red. So what you can see here is that when you look at the top predators, the density remains almost zero across body sizes. Basically what you are seeing, what we are showing here on this red line is that in places that you had a lot of humans, we take always the bigger fish, right? In places where there are no humans, you can see that ecosystems normally had a higher proportion of big fish. Makes sense, right? You think about the Northern Hawaiian Islands, there is no people there, so you get to see a lot of big fish. When you go and look at places like Oahu, where there is a lot of fish, there is no where there is a lot of people, there is not a lot of big fish there. So it seems that in nature, even under natural conditions of no human impact, you don't get to have a smaller top predators, right? So normally those, in places, anywhere, you don't get to see too many small predators. But in places that had no humans, top predators get to be very big, very abundant, while in places that you had a lot of people, top predators that is large get to be pretty rare. Now, what happens to the herbivorous fish, the ones that get fed on by the top predators? What you see actually is that in places that had a lot of humans, the density of small herbivorous increases quite a lot. So what we speculate here is the fact that this shape on that relationship between functioning and richness declining as you increase the number of people but bouncing back is simply an ecosystem release from you having top predators in places where no human, the relationship being super stiff. Humans start depleting their resources, and as a result of that depletion, you start losing top predators, you start increasing the density of smaller herbivorous, and then it's that increasing the density of smaller herbivorous that causes the increase in biomass there. But one of the things that I want you to look at is the axis of these columns. You can see on places that had no humans how you can produce up to 1,200 kilograms of biomass. I don't remember what the units on this thing, but you can see that the units are the same on all axes. Here is 1200 in places where there are no humans. In places where you had humans, despite the fact that the relationship is trying to come back up, the scale only goes up to 900, right? So again, what we speculate on this paper is that humans seem to induce some kind of trophic changes in reef communities, which in turn changes the way in which energy flows through that ecosystem. It's very similar to the work that was shown earlier by Peter Morin, when you start killing fish, killing in certain groups of species within ecosystems by warming, right? When you kill the top predators and the herbivores, most of the biomass is produced by the producers, but that biomass is still insignificant to compare to the biomass that is produced by entire ecosystem. We are explaining the same thing here. Ecosystems produce a lot of biomass when there is no humans. When you start having human impacts on those ecosystems start changing the composition of a species, so that at the very end you ended up with a huge density of smaller herbivores. Obviously, the amount of biomass that is produced by these species doesn't compare at all to the biomass that is produced on reefs that had no humans. So why the whole thing is important though? Why is it important for us to understand this ecosystem functioning? Well, one of the things that I want you to realize is that at the end of the day, biodiversity, abundance, and body size, they come together into this thing called ecosystem functioning. And that ecosystem functioning is what feeds humanity at the end of the day. The turnover efficiency in which the energy and resources flow through those ecosystems is what we feed on, right? And as we established today, with this massive transformation of ecosystems, we are losing goods and services that sustain humanity. So we're talking about here is that with us impairing the capacity of ecosystems to function well, we're impairing the capacity of those ecosystems again to deliver goods and services that influence human welfare. And in this class, I already pointed out to you some serious statistics in the order of 1 billion people going hungry and another 1 billion people lacking good water and things like that. There is also the economic value that we established before. This paper that we talked earlier by Constanza that calculated the total goods and services from nature in the order of $33 trillion relies obviously or assumes that all of these ecosystems are effective at producing biomass. So we are not only affecting, again, welfare, as I explained earlier, but also the economic return that we get from nature. Let me summarize the class. Again, one of the key questions in biogeography is this relationship between the functioning of ecosystems and the richness. It has been found, it's almost universal, that in experiments that relationship is saturating. The reason why, well, one possibility is that paper by Laurent saying that it could be complementarity, where species just complement each other and that increases the functioning as you increase richness. Or the other one is what is called a sampling effect. Basically, by chance alone, you might get some species that are effective at producing biomass. What factors influence that relationship? Basically, we found that among all of those experimental studies, there is a variability on the slope of that relationship. Some of the factors that can influence that relationship are the history of colonization, all of those papers by by Peter Morin, the heterogeneity, that one paper in PLOS Biology, disturbances, this is the work by Brad Cardinale, and ecological interactions. And Peter Morin also had the last paper talking about ecological interactions and disturbances playing together to influence the shape of this relationship. We also describe how in nature this same relationship between functioning and richness is actually concave up. And we speculate that the factors that could influence that relationship are human population. The reason why this relationship is important for us to understand is because at the core of it is the production of goods and services that we obtain from nature, and that is going to influence human welfare. And that finishes the class for today, and see you guys in the next episode.